Welcome back to the program, TCK Potters. I'm your host, Sky Guasco. This is another episode of the Candlestick Kids Fantasy Football Podcast. I'm joined by my man, Bobby Lamarco, continuing our mini-series of running back steals from 2021, and we are recapping how they got there and how we might be able to find a new batch of running back steals in drafts according to ADP average draft position come August and draft season. We have already covered Jonathan Taylor. We've already covered Austin Eckler. Today we are talking about Joe Mixon of the Super Bowl runner-up Cincinnati football Bengals. Bob, I'll let you kick it off here, and then I'll give you a 2022 preview.
Yeah, so basically today, what we want, the real purpose of this is to find what made these guys steals in drafts, what elevated them from their ADP versus where they finished, and hopefully to take this information and apply it to our research in 2022 to find guys that can have similar situations and trajectories. That's how we find value in drafts. So let's talk Joe Mixon today, folks. Joe Mixon, it seemed that the truthers finally got their wish, right? Joe Mixon has been hasn't lived up to fruition for multiple years because of injury and whatever other reasons, but he's never taken that step until this season. On average, amongst the sites that we use for positional ADP, Fantasy Pros tallies this up. 12.5 was his ADP on average amongst those sites. He finished fourth in points per game and third overall. So that was a big time jump for him than it was in years past. Now, when you dive into his consistency, Mixon is a little boom bust. He is. And the consistency numbers kind of show this. How we've been doing this throughout the show is we talk elite games, which is 21 points or more, 21 points or more in half-point PPR. 43% of his games were elite. So that means 7 of the games that he played, he had week-winning weeks. Those are big-time games. But he slips all the way. That was third, by the way. He slips to 18th in RB1 games because he 43% of his games. So he was like all feast or famine. So he was an RB1, but he was an elite RB1 in those same exact games. He didn't have any other games where he was an RB1. That's 14 points per game. And then he comes about 9th in RB2 finishes. That's 11.7. So when you start looking at this, he is a little more boomer bust than some of the other guys we've talked about so far. Because, even though he finished third overall, fourth in points per game, he's 9th in RB2 games overall and 18th in RB1 games. So he is a little feast or famine. Couple drivers of why he became and took this league. Number one is his touches. He had a career high in touches, 334. Now, if you look at his touches per game, it was kind of on par with what we've seen in the past. The only thing about him is he stayed healthy. Sky brought this up on the last podcast. You just play 12 games and you get a lot of touches, you're probably going to finish very good. That's what happened with Joe Mixon, essentially. But on top of that, he also had his career best touchdown rate. 4.8% of his touches were touchdowns this season. His career average is 3.1. So that was great for him. If we do apply his career average to this season, I like to do that because if you have an outlier year in touchdown percentage, it drops by 2.2%, which would have made him the RB11. And that kind of aligns a little bit more with what we're seeing in his consistency. So maybe that's something to look at. When you're looking at the offensive line, still a lot of question marks. The good news is Jonah Williams, their first-round pick, finally stayed healthy and was really good down the stretch. Preseason PFF had them ranked 25th. End of season, they finished 20th, so we did see a little bit of a progression there. So, Sky, the question comes, basically your biggest takeaways from Mixon this year, and what are you thinking? Do you think he's going to repeat now that Joe Burrow, which I'll talk about in a second, but I think Joe Burrow was the biggest catalyst of all this because of how he propped up that offense, but what's that 2022 outlook looking like?
Yeah, so he finished fourth in PPR, and again, I reiterate this every single show. I generally talk in PPR language. You talk in half PPR. So the numbers aren't the same, but they're very close usually. But, we have different audiences, so we try to cover our bases. Number 4 in PPR is very good, obviously. It was by far his best fantasy finish. Last year, 49th. We know that he only scored a handful of touchdowns. He was injured, and Joe Burrow went down and all that. Can he repeat? Bob, that's the question with all of these top guys, right? We talked about with Jonathan Taylor. Can he be the number 1 guy? Can Austin Eckler be number 2? Can Joe Mixon be number 4 again? I hate to cop out on this one, but either yes, he could be top 3 for a number of reasons, or I think he could fall down to back end RB1. Two factors. A, which direction do the Bengals go next year? They were extremely run heavy last year. And of course, a lot of that had to do with Joe Burrow going down. But even when Joe Burrow was coming out as a rookie early on, they were heavy and they leaned on Mixon. He got a lot of work, still didn't produce a lot of touchdowns. This year, obviously, they were on fire, especially in the second half. Jamar Chase was unbelievable. T. Higgins, Tyler Boyd, CJ Uzomah before he went down, and Joe Mixon, even Samaje Perine, Chris Evans at times, and Joe Burrow. They were phenomenal, ended up in the Super Bowl. The problem is, I'm worried about the offensive line still. They got to stay healthy. They got to draft heavy. They went Jamar Chase last year. It worked out for this year. They got to get heavy. I do think he can repeat as a top 5 back, but touchdown regression, Bob, is going to happen. 16 touchdowns. That's double what he's ever had in his rest of his career. 1,200 yards, he might be able to repeat on the ground. 42 receptions, most in his career. 314 receiving yards, most in his career. A career year is really sexy, but it also is like gives you that automatic regression. So I hate to cop out, but I do think he could be top 5 or top 3. But if he has less than 12 touchdowns, I think he's going to fall probably to like RB8, because why not throw to all of those incredible weapons with Joe Burrow taking another step?
I think the X factor in all this is Joe Burrow. I think my thing is when I'm looking at Joe Mixon's season, he never had an elite quarterback. I mean, Andy Dalton was fine, but Andy Dalton was like league average in his prime. Joe Mixon really didn't play with Andy Dalton in his prime either, right? It was 2018, 17, and then he had the hodgepodge going on. Andy Dalton was in, a lot of AJ Green started getting hurt. The offense went to shambles. And then last year, he only played 6 games. So we didn't get to see the full allotment of Joe Mixon with Joe Burrow until this season. And sure enough, he got, there are more opportunities at the goal line. But if you start looking at Joe Burrow and when the team started getting more healthy, the biggest driver was his touchdowns. I mean, you start looking at right around, I would say, week 7, week 8, the guy was finding the end zone almost every single week because Joe Burrow got healthy. They were in scoring position more. And the thing about the Bengals, they don't abandon the run. So that's the nice thing about Zach Taylor. He has been criticized about being too conservative. And I do agree, Joe Burrow will be unleashed. But if you unleash Joe Burrow, that means they're going to be in more scoring opportunities. And I think when you see Zach Taylor, he does have ties to Sean McVay. I know it goes way before Sean McVay, but those offenses have been very run heavy, close to the goal line. We saw it with Todd Gurley for years. So yeah. I do believe in Joe Mixon a lot. I do think it is propped up. The thing is, when you look at his fantasy points per rush attempt, it was an outlier season based on his career averages, but he wasn't like an outlier overall. He averaged a 0.68 for every carry. He generated 0.68 fantasy points and half-point PPR. That's like 30th in the NFL. It's not really that. It's okay. It's above average, but it wasn't like he had this crazy outlier season overall in those aspects. So I am buying Joe Mixon.
Yep.
Same. Now the question, like you just said, though, is are we taking him where? Because it looks like CMC, JT, Derrick
Eckler,
Henry,
Cook. Yep.
Eckler is 4, Cook 5. Where are we taking? So your thoughts early preseason. I'm going to pull up the PFF ranks, but what's your first thought when you're going to draft him? 6 to 8 range?
6 to 8 range feels good. Yep. And again, now here's an issue, Bob. Like, we know he's incredibly talented. He was incredibly talented coming out of Oklahoma. Gio Bernard was around as the pass catching back, and all of us were pulling our hair out for seasons in fantasy. Like, throw this kid the ball. He's extremely talented. Gio leaves. Mixon gets more work in the passing game, but still just 28th among running backs, not players. Among running backs, Joe Mixon had the 28th most, or least you could say. He had the 28th most targets per running backs. That's not going to cut it. He had 3 games on the entire season with 6 or more targets. For a featured number 1 back that has 20 touches a game potential to get 6 targets in a single game just 3 times over the year when he was healthy, I don't like that at all. And I mentioned it with Eckler. I mentioned it with JT. JT, Naji Harris, I believe, and maybe Derrick Henry, but moving forward, are the outliers. Adrian Peterson, right, was a guy that didn't catch the ball a lot, but he didn't need to. Everybody else needs to catch the football. And when they do that, they, excel in fantasy football. If Joe Mixon can get into like the top 20 range of targets next year, I think he can absolutely repeat where he's at. If not, he's going to need those touchdowns again. 16 touchdowns is a lot, man. If he falls down to even 12, or 10, 11, probably more realistically, like, he's going to plummet as far as running backs go. He might be the, 10, 12 range. So a little concerned there. Overall, though, I do like Joe Mixon, and I will be buying in 2022. But if he jumps into that like top 5 range, I'm not going to. If I can get him at 7, 8, 9 as a running back, I'd be all in.
Yeah, so let's talk quickly about potential. I think the biggest takeaways for me with Joe Mixon is he was getting elite touches per game even prior to this season. So he was in the 20 range prior to this year. So when I'm looking at potential Joe Mixons for next year, I want to find guys that potentially could see a nice bump in quarterback play, but also get those touches.
Yep.
So I have a short list. You just tell me your thoughts here about these guys. Naji Harris comes up real quick for me because he gets those elite touches. He does need a better quarterback play. Now, the only thing with Naji is that we don't know who the quarterback's going to be. It's not going to be like a top 5 pick.
You don't love Duck Hodges coming into 2022?
I mean, nothing gets me going like a good Duck Hodges combo, but we're going to focus on Joe Mixon for now. The other one's Elijah Mitchell. This guy was a machine, and he was averaging roughly 20 touches a game at his peak this season when he was healthy and getting the ball. Who knows what that offense could do with Trey Lance going into his second year. David Montgomery is another one who gets elite touches. I mean, David Montgomery also and Elijah Mitchell both had below average percentage of their fantasy points were touchdowns. So if they get that Joe Mixon bump, they could be taking the next step as well. Cam Akers. Now, I know it's kind of an interesting thing here because you have the Matthew Stafford effect. We saw what Darrell Henderson was doing for most of the season before his injury. Then Sony Michel, they wanted to use a bell cow, it looked like, which is nice. They did try that rotation, I guess, in the playoffs. But for the most part this season, Cam Akers potentially could be an option too. And then finally, which I think we're always just going to bring him up every episode, is Javonte Williams. Like Javonte, we saw the glimmer when Melvin Gordon was out that one game. They actually didn't give Mike Boone much work. They gave it all to Javonte. And if they bring in a nice quarterback, competent quarterback, who knows where he can go. So of that list, anybody stand out? Naji's your guy, and Javonte's like probably going to be our poster boy for 2022. But give me your quick thoughts.
Yeah, I compared Naji Harris coming up to last year's Jonathan Taylor, right? Naji Harris is my guy that doesn't need to catch, 80 balls next year, which he could because he led the NFL in targets anyway at running back. But he could take that step to the number 1. So I'll keep him with Jonathan Taylor. I think he could be better than Joe Mixon, frankly, this last year. So I'll leave that one. Javonte, obviously, but so much has to do with Melvin Gordon. 2 names you had on that list before I heard you make the list that I had in my mind. Elijah Mitchell. But so much comes down to like, do the Niners bring back 6 more running backs? Is he the number 1 guy? I'm a 49er fan, man. 5 years in a row, we've gone into fantasy with the number 1 running back, and that guy gets hurt. 4 more guys get hurt, and the 5th string guy comes up. Let's not forget, right? Carlos Hyde was behind Frank Gore back in the day, all right? Then he finally came up. Raheem Mostert was 5th string. Jeff Wilson was 5th string, right? I mean, Elijah Mitchell was a 6th-round running back. Wasn't even supposed to make the team. He ended up being the starter in the playoffs, right? So there's so many options here for the 49ers. I do like Elijah Mitchell. The big one, though, that you mentioned, another running back by committee on paper right now. By week 3, I don't think it's a contest. Cam Akers, by far, is my comp for Joe Mixon this year. 20 touches is what Sean McVay wants to do. And if he gets Todd Gurley work, I think Cam Akers can do more than Todd Gurley did, which was the number 1 running back in fantasy football. So I don't believe in your boy Sony Michel. We've been over this so many times. Darrell Henderson is fine, but I think he's a great complimentary third down, give him a breather kind of a guy. Cam Akers is a full-fledged dude. He came back early from an Achilles, which is unbelievable. I think he's ready to go next year off the Super Bowl. Great offensive line, still great offense. I love Cam Akers next year. He's going to be my Joe Mixon comp for now.
Just to close out the show, I want to say this. I think Elijah Mitchell is the Shanahan's Alfred Morris, late round guy.
Ooh, Al Morris, nice call.
And I think he stays healthy and he takes over that role for years to come. All right, that's it. That's our running back steal episode for Joe Mixon, guys. Real quick and easy. Once again, I'm Bobby LaMarco, your host of the Candlestick Kids Fantasy Football Podcast with Sky Gawasko on the Fantasy Focused YouTube channel. All our episodes are brought to you by BetOnline AG and on the Believe Podcast Network. Thank you for joining us again. We'll be back later today to talk Damian Harris. So thanks for joining, guys. We are out of here.